Welcome to the Engage and Empower podcast. Behind every successful company is an intentional and innovative approach to empowering your most valuable asset, your people. Join me in having conversations with people and talent leaders as we share our journeys and unpack what it takes to build strong, cohesive teams and employee experiences. From executives at early-stage startups to innovators at large public companies, we'll capture the compelling stories of the people behind people teams. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to the Engage and Empower podcast. I'm your host, Rasika Rajagopalan, and today I am pumped to be chatting with a fellow Wolfpack alum, Darren Murph, the head of remote at GitLab. GitLab has been a global, fully distributed company from day one and has been leading the conversation around remote best practices long before it was broadly in style as it is today. So definitely ahead of their time. Darren, I am so excited to chat with you today on all things remote work and learn more about what you've been up to at GitLab. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm really eager to hear all about your story and everything you've been up to lately. Your career is really interesting and you've been all over the map working in different types of companies and different roles. So tell me about the journey and how you landed in your role leading head of remote at GitLab.
It's been a interesting and fun and wild and unconventional journey. Kind of the best experience. The best kinds of experiences are totally nonlinear, and that applies to me. So my educational background, go Pack, by the way, is in business management. So I have an MBA. I did spend some time in supply chain and logistics, but I realized early on that communications, storytelling, marketing, that world was much more interesting to me. And that is really where my passions were. So my remote journey started in a very unglamorous way. I was a contributing editor to a consumer technology publication called Engadget. I later went on to earn a Guinness World Record there in publishing, become the managing editor, led to a few other leadership roles in the marketing, comms, and public relations spaces. And then I ended up at GitLab. I got a phone call from someone at GitLab and they said, "Hey, have you ever heard of GitLab?" I said, "No." And they said, "Well, we don't have any offices and we did it on purpose." And I said, "Hold on, I need to take a seat before you explain the rest of this." And it has been a fascinating experience working at GitLab. It's a 1,300 person company. We have people in more than 65 countries and no company-owned offices.
Wow. And how big was the company when you joined, and what did the people team look like then, and what does it look like now?
It was around 700 people when I joined. So in about a year to a year and a half, it almost doubled in size. So rapid scaling. And I would argue that the scaling at that rate was largely made possible because we didn't have to move offices 3 or 4 times. The fact that we were all remote contributed to the ability to grow that quickly.
Right. So what guided GitLab's thinking in deciding initially to be a fully remote company? I mean, now you see a lot of companies taking that approach, but GitLab was much earlier in that decision. So what guided that thinking and what challenges did you face kind of being early in that approach?
Yeah, GitLab's the OG remote company. I had someone tell me the other day that GitLab was doing remote before remote was cool. And not only that, but I would argue before it was accepted. I've been working across the spectrum of remote my entire career. And for 15 years, I've been fighting against the natural geographic bias, where the first employer to employee interaction is the employer trying to persuade someone to uproot their entire life and move somewhere else. Like getting off to an interesting start going that route, but that was the conventional norm. So GitLab, when it was founded, the founding team were in several different countries. They were remote by default. And Sid, the co-founder and CEO, saw early on that intentional remote work could be leveraged as a competitive advantage from a hiring standpoint, from a retention and recruiting standpoint, from an accessibility to talent standpoint, from scaling very quickly, almost every standpoint. Most other companies saw remote as a thorn in their side or a challenge they had to overcome. But by simply looking at the problem and framing it through opportunity instead of scarcity, he was able to grow GitLab at a rate that dazzles people. And we have been able to accomplish more in a shorter amount of time than many other companies in this space over the same amount of time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that definitely makes sense when you don't have, I mean, hiring in itself is something that is an operational load on a business, you remove the office management piece of that equation. You're able to scale really quickly. You're able to get talent from so many different countries, different experiences, different perspectives, which is super cool. What challenges did you face with, I mean, now there are so many tools and systems, right? Like you have brainstorming tools out there. There's probably better video conferencing tools out there. There's better just tools like Slack and things like that that may not have existed back then. So how did you work around a lot of those technical pieces of being a distributed company?
So one of our substantiating values at GitLab is boring solutions. So with every potential hurdle, we try to find the most boring solution to that problem. And that started with the company handbook. At GitLab, we try not to use the word documentation. We say that we work handbook first. And so we built a company handbook. Think of this as a company wiki, but it's a living, breathing, evolving organism that everyone can contribute to, not just senior leadership. We built this very early on. And so the founding team recognized the value of documenting early. It essentially is the operating manual to our company. Our values are documented. Our culture is documented. What it looks like to collaborate and iterate at GitLab is documented. Each functional part of the organization has a section of the handbook where they document all of the ways that they work, all of our processes and policies. It's over 10,000 pages today, but it started as 0. It started as a blank cursor on a page. And by documenting that early on, it helped us maintain a single source of truth of how we worked and how we communicated. So as tools come and go, it's less disruptive because the core ways of working are written down in a simple static site. And you'll see a lot of companies now leaning on tools like Almanac or Notion to do something similar to that. And I think it's critical. And we can talk about this later on, but for transitioning organizations, a lot of them are asking me, where do we start? And I say, well, you should hire a head of remote. This is a big job. It's a complete re-architecting of how you work. But if you can't quite wrap your head around that, at least hire a chief documentarian, somebody that comes in and shadows your organization, adds taxonomy and codification to the ways that you work, and start writing that down. That way, when you're piloting new tools, you always have a centralized baseline to refer back to.
Yeah, I think to your point, I mean, these tools are just an avenue to get you to a shared way of working. It's just a tool to enable you to get you there, but they're not necessarily the solution in itself. And so I think having all of that written down in a place where, everyone's able to refer to it and it's almost like shared operating principles is super helpful. I love that your handbook and that all of these guides are open source. So what guided that for you all? And did you feel like other companies may soon follow suit in sort of joining the remote first movement? What guided that for you?
A couple of things. One, GitLab is an open core company. So that open source ethos, it was very natural for us to do that and build in public. But the second thing is transparency is one of our core values. And we don't do transparency purely for its altruistic nature. We do it because it's great business practice. When you build in public, other companies can see it and contribute back to your knowledge base to make you better. If you build in a silo, no one can give you input or feedback. So you really have no barometer of how well you're doing. So we do that across all of our documentation because our community makes us better and we see it happening every day. Increasingly, I do think companies are recognizing the massive competitive advantage that building in public provides. This goes counter to the conventional wisdom, which is everything is on a need-to-know basis. Keep information as close to the chest as you possibly can until you need to let someone else see it. But in a remote world, what you're realizing is two things. One, if people have input and feedback, you want them to have an avenue to give that to you early so that you don't go way off course before they're able to come in and give you good advice. But the second thing is that there's a close link between transparency and visibility of information within an organization and the sense of belonging in an organization, especially in a remote team when it could be months or years before you see someone in person. Having access to that information makes you feel like you belong to the same team. And as people leaders try to figure out how do we build and sustain culture in a remote setting, I say start with your product, start with your work, make it as visible and accessible to as many people as possible. And naturally, people will feel like they belong to something that is bigger than just what they're working on day to day.
Yeah. I think to that point also, the way that folks work in a remote company may not be for everyone. And the product that, any given company is working on may not be for everyone. It also may excite a lot of people. And so I'm sure that being early in that space, you're actually bringing a lot more awareness around, this model works and it exists. And if this is compelling to you, like, come join the team. If not, and remote companies aren't for everyone, at least you have, a very clear idea of this is how we work here. And if this doesn't align with you and you want to go into an office and you want to work in a different way, like there are so many other companies out there for you. So very much like values alignment as individuals are interviewing and checking other companies out. I think having that transparency around how you're working is super helpful in bringing people on board that feel really excited and aligned to that.
I want to point out one thing you just said on values alignment. It brings up a good point, which is GitLab doesn't hire for culture fit. We hire for values fit. We actually pull up the GitLab values page in an interview. We want people to read this in advance, and it needs to resonate with them. Because if we hire someone that wants to work in accordance to the values that exist, they can bring all of their culture to work, and it will be a culture add. If you hire for culture fit, you're asking people to fit under a bar. Your status quo always stays the same. But if you hire for values fit, your culture just gets better and better and more rich and more deep as you bring people in and you know that they're going to adhere to the values. And that's just a slight twist in how you think about things, but it removes a lot of bias and it makes sure that people know what they're getting into. GitLab publishes its strategy. We have an FAQ where one of the first sections I added was, what's it like to work at GitLab? Just a very simple 3-paragraph approach to what is it like to work here in an all remote setting. I think more companies will be forced to add this going forward because coming out of COVID, if they say we're all going back to the office, this rigidity contributes to whatever it is that we want to make our company, at least be open about that. Hopefully there'll be less surprises and then people can align the companies that they work for with what makes them tick. So you don't take a role and then 6 months in realize, this flexibility isn't exactly what was pitched to me during the interview process. The more clarity on that, the better. And the further that you can give that to people kind of up the funnel, it purifies your recruiting funnel.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think it's important that I love that you're sharing that, you share the values page and you talk a lot about it in the interview. The reality is first of all, in distributed companies, I don't think you can camouflage values with the office and the social buzz that you're seeing when you step in to interview for a given role. Like the values are really grounded in how people are working, how people are collaborating. And I think bringing that up in an interview then gives you the opportunity to have a dialogue around it, which is what values look like. I think at distributed companies, it's really like, how do you operate as a business? I think it's really critical that you do that because without opening up the conversation, without giving people resources, they're not organically picking up some of those pieces, if they were to walk in and just kind of absorb that secondhand.
And you bring up a good point, which is values are a verb. Most companies try to paint values as a noun, but culture is actually the barometer of how well a company is adhering to the values that are laid out. And in this great remote migration, many companies are realizing that their values aren't as well documented as they need to be, or if they are just a few words on a wall, you actually need sub-values or substantiators. For example, iteration, collaboration, and transparency are 3 of our values at GitLab, but they mean something different to everyone listening to this. Everyone's view of transparency is painted based on their past experience. So it's not good enough to just say transparency is a value. You have to actually have substantial anecdotes on what transparency looks like at your company. That is how you empower people to live a value. And that is how you move from needing an office to enforce things like that to having it written down so that your values become location agnostic, which would be the ultimate goal. Even if you have everyone in the office, you want to make sure that your values are resilient to the next crisis that forces everyone out of the office.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. And bringing them up in conversation, having them written down, you're constantly reevaluating them just as you would any other strategic decision, which is super important to continuously, make sure that they still feel true to you as an organization at your current stage. So there are tons of
values I just want to mention this. The GitLab values page had over 100 iterations last year.
Wow. Wow.
And so even years into a company, it's still worth evolving your values to make sure they work.
Right. 100%. I mean, they're your operating principles. And so if you need to make changes, you need to make changes. So lots of really great resources in your handbook that employees and others, even outside of the company, are able to take advantage of. In a fully distributed company, what's your guidance on what the people team should look like and how they can partner with employees and build camaraderie as people are apart? You talked about the head of remote, but just in general, when you look at, a 500-person in-person company and the people team and the support that employees get from a people team, how does that look different in a company that is fully distributed? What's your recommendation there?
So I'm going to give you two pieces here. And the first one is very paradoxical. People teams in distributed company should do everything they can to make sure people are empowered to build their identities outside of work. Culture at work is largely built from what people do outside of work. This is very different from the conventional norms of getting everyone into a shared space and doing happy hours and forcing people to spend a lot of time together. I'll give you an anecdote here. On a Friday afternoon, you may feel inclined to get everyone together for a Zoom virtual happy hour, which sounds like a good idea on paper. But here's an alternative. What if you told everyone at the company to take the last hour of Friday off and go spend that hour in their local community, wherever that's at in the world, doing something meaningful to them? Maybe that's volunteering at a local school or a food bank or a community center or helping out a neighbor, something that gives life to you and moves society forward. So at GitLab, we have 1,300 people. So imagine we did that on a Friday. So now we have 1,300 hours of progress being made in various parts of the world. That is the kind of water cooler talk that you want to focus on Monday. So when you empower people to do their jobs effectively and efficiently, and then disengage with work and go engage with the communities that have taken them to the places that they are, you want that type of cultural richness fed back into the organization. So in many organizations, the people group is there to bring people together as much as possible. But I would encourage you to think about getting people into their communities as much as possible, and then seeing what comes back. The second thing that I want to surface here is be open to feedback. When you have people in various states or even regions, definitely in countries and continents, it's impossible to know everything. So be open to people providing suggestions on what you can do to help service them or move the organization forward. Directors in a remote company, managers in a remote company are less directors and more unblockers. You just stay open to feedback and let people tell you what they need. And in many cases, people groups in remote companies need to be more open to feedback and less directing. And that takes some getting used to.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. What you're pointing at is the idea of having shared experiences doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is in a room together doing the same activity in the same place at the same time. I think that's good advice even for global companies that do have in-person offices. It's something that at a previous company, we had offices all over the world, and philanthropy was really core to our identity as a business. And every year around the holidays, every office would work on something together. We'd share pictures, we'd talk about it. And it was, an in-person company, but that's a lot more meaningful than getting everyone together virtually, or it felt very authentic in how each office was able to express our core values in a way that was authentic to them in their country, their community. So I think that's a great piece of advice.
And in-person matters a lot. I've had a few people leaders come to me and say, how can we make our culture work without people ever seeing each other? And that's not the goal. I don't know that that's possible. Humans are relational, communal beings, and in-person matters a lot. So even at GitLab, we get the entire company together at least once a year for a company-wide summit. Almost no work happens. It's just for excursions and bonding and hanging out with humans. That matters. And so make sure that you do budget for travel to be used as a point of cultural leverage. If you're going all remote or even hybrid remote, get people together. People want to see each other. But you want to set up the atmosphere where when they get together, they do talk about work, but also they talk about what makes their lives unique. And they feel comfortable bringing in those unique experiences and observances from wherever in the world they happen to call home.
Right, right. When it comes to headcount on the people team, do you feel like distributed companies require more people on the people ops side or on the HR business partnership side or on the programming side? Do you feel like it is a higher headcount people team in a distributed company than a in-person company, or they're the same, just the focus area looks a little different for a distributed people team?
I don't know if the quantity of people would differ much, but I think it becomes a much more efficient organization. So here's what I mean by that. We definitely have people in a remote company that focus on things like tax and legal because there's complications that come with operating in dozens of countries around the world. You need experts to be able to handle this, that if you only operate in a small region of the world, you simply don't have those challenges. But on weeks where we would onboard 30, 40, 50 people in a week, a conventional company would need basically a 1-to-1 ratio of someone in people ops to the new hire to help them get up to speed and meet the right people and meet their stakeholders and get all of the access set up. At GitLab, our onboarding process is so well documented, and we use the GitLab platform to onboard our new hires, that you need far fewer person hours to onboard someone because you teach them the art of self-service and they're able to onboard themselves much more appropriately because a lot of that onboarding is documented. So all of those person hours are able to be spent on something much more impactful, like one-to-ones with other people in the organizations and moving things forward instead of having to do something like onboarding, which is largely repetitive.
Right, right. You're addressing problems and you're addressing processes in a way that is uniquely different. You have an advantage in that you can approach it differently than an in-person company, which then enables you to be more efficient that way, which is super cool. So switching gears a little bit, one of the most interesting trends that I'm curious to follow over the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years is compensation as more companies move to a distributed or hybridized model. And so I'm curious, with GitLab being really early in this, how have you thought about compensation as a distributed company across geographies? Like, what's your philosophy, and how do you encourage other companies that are starting or transitioning to fully remote to think about this in a way that's equitable?
So I'll lean on GitLab's handbook for this to shortcut the answer, but all of our compensation principles are documented. And so instead of me verbalizing it for half an hour, I would just say to Google GitLab compensation principles and you'll have them all there. Honestly, that's what we recommend to other companies is take a look at what we've done and then see if it's applicable to you. Each company is uniquely different. If you're a 100,000 person operation that used to have 40 offices and now you're moving to 20 or none, that's a very different paradigm. If you're a 10 person startup that was all remote from inception, also a very different paradigm. The overall advice I would give here is if you're considering compensation changes based on remote, make sure you play the long game. Great talent is hard to find and also very expensive to backfill. So it's not as simple as just making a change based on where someone moves. And this is moving so rapidly and changing so rapidly that you have to take all of this market data with a bit of a grain of salt because numbers are changing by the day. Look at major rental markets in San Francisco and New York compared to places like Missoula, Montana. And the day-to-day changes in those percentages are really, really surprising.
Yeah, I think documenting it and keeping it there for you to continue to reference enables you to be consistent. And you're right that it's not an easy problem because the data is certainly catching up with the shift in trends. I think comp data is generally like 6 months behind where we are today. And so, that's super interesting. How do you generally move quickly and remain agile as a team that's distributed across so many different geographies and time zones? I think one thing that's interesting about GitLab is the global piece. Like, you don't have people that are necessarily working in even just like a 3-hour window. And so do you think strategically about who you have on what teams and where they're located? Can anybody work in any area, in any team? Or like, what does that look like in a way that enables you to be successful?
Using the GitLab platform is critical in overcoming time zones. So all of our work across all functions engineering, legal, communications, the entire company uses the GitLab platform to collaborate. So it gets a lot easier when you have one place to go. You know where work is happening. You don't have to go hunt for other pieces of work in different systems or wait until someone wakes up on the other side of the world to ask them a question about where something is. So step one would be centralize your work in one place so that people can have access to it no matter what time zone they're in. The second thing is we intentionally try to hire in a diverse array of time zones to make us less reliant on synchronicity. There is certainly value in having an entire team all in one time zone. I'm not saying there isn't value in that, but if you really want to grow your remote muscle, hiring people in other time zones forces you to get better at asynchronous workflows, which has a lot of follow-on benefits. Number one, it de-risks your business. It makes you more able to handle things related to business continuity. But the other part here is it makes you a better communicator. If you have to communicate things in the written word or verbalized over tools like YouTube or Loom, you're able to contextualize things in a deeper way. So at GitLab, we call this low context communication. You communicate statuses and where you're at in a project in a way that anyone could come along midstream and loop themselves into the project. You want deep storytellers, deep communicators as a part of a remote team so that there's rich documentation along every step of the process. Now, you could force this even in a co-located environment where everyone's in the same time zone, but humans are creatures of habit, and we generally don't want to slow down to go fast. We don't want to stop and put that rigor and effort into the documentation. So by forcing your team to operate across a larger time zone gap, you force some really good functions and habits in there as well.
Yeah. So would you say the role of the manager at GitLab is to continue to reinforce some of these practices, or what type of enablement do you provide your managers to continuously make sure that all of these behaviors are well adopted consistently?
Yeah, absolutely that. And in fact, our L&D team is spinning up a more robust manager enablement program right now. And the cool thing about GitLab being open source is you can just search for that and actually take some of the courses that we're spinning up for our own team. I'll also say that we have a remote team management curriculum on Coursera, which is completely free to take. And that's our best remote manager practices that we've learned over the years. So you can get the best of GitLab in that Coursera program. So if that's relevant to you, definitely check that out. But managers are so critical in reinforcing the ways that we want to work, reinforcing the values. Our executive team visibly takes time off because we want to send the signal that, hey, you can take time off. Please prioritize your well-being. It's absolutely essential that the managers lead as they want to be followed. And I don't think this is unique to a remote team, but you do have to visibly do some of these things in more unique ways because no one can look across the office and see you doing it. You have to do it more deliberately within GitLab, the platform, or Slack, or wherever communication is happening.
Right, right. And then, earlier you talked about the importance on the team level, on the org level of managing the asynchronous and then video with the in-person meetings. How do you format some of your in-person meetups? I imagine it's different than an in-person kickoff where you're probably looking to set up experiences that you couldn't otherwise have remotely. So what do those look like?
Yeah, so for in-person engagements that are work-related, we have a Google Doc agenda going days, weeks, maybe even months in advance. So in non-COVID times, we get our executive team together every quarter for an on-site, a very intense 2.5 or 3 day session. But that agenda is ongoing. It's a perpetual agenda, and we try to stack things up that we can just blow through in a very condensed amount of time. So strange as it may sound, make your synchronous on-sites as asynchronous as possible and do a lot of the planning up front in a shared document. But the other thing is, in doing so, you recognize just how much work can actually be done in that document. And the goal would be to get to the on-site and then look at the agenda doc and think, oh, we already did all of this, so let's just hang out as people. In-person time is best spent building culture and rapport. Using in-person time for work is a poorer ROI. I'm not saying it's not useful at all, but I'm saying if you had the two to choose from, you will catalyze much more rapport and long-term success in an organization by getting people together and letting them climb a mountain or go to a baseball game than you would getting them in a room and forcing them to sit down and whiteboard next quarter strategy, which could easily be done using Google Docs or Mural.
Yep. Yeah. You want to think about like how long can this experience carry you? And I think a lot of the camaraderie building activities, those really carry the team for months on end versus a simple problem that you are solving that you could have done virtually. Like, great, you've solved that problem in that setting, but how long did that really carry the team? Something to think about. Well, this has been so helpful. You have clearly, been doing this fully distributed. You've been managing this fully distributed approach for a while. Are there remote tools or places that you go or resources, even specific sections of the GitLab handbook that you'd recommend other companies take advantage of?
Yeah, so we have a page dedicated to tools and technologies that we're always evolving. So I would say go to allremote.info, allremote.info. That takes you into the remote specific portion of the GitLab handbook. And then once you're in there, you'll find over 40 guides on how we do everything from meetings to how we think about asynchronous to our list of tools and resources. Get a really tall cup of coffee. You could be in there a while. I've added over 100,000 words to this section just in the last year, but it is very comprehensive. And if you're a company that has something to contribute back, it's open source. Just send me a message on Twitter. I'm at Darren Murph, and we'd be happy to add it.
Love it. And what's your approach to this generally? Like with so many new tools coming out, do you generally look for new tools as things start breaking? Are you proactively always looking for new ways software can help your organization? How do you balance that? Because I do imagine it could be a little overwhelming with so many new resources emerging.
Overwhelming is the word for it. So GitLab is so well known in the remote space, the tools come to us. So there's quite the process of trying to evaluate and vet these. We are in the golden era of remote enabling tools. They were already looking pretty good before COVID, but now that COVID has happened, there's an entire cottage industry within the venture capital world solely focused on enabling teams that don't sit in the same building every day. A few of my favorites are Loom. It's great for async video. Voodle is really good for short contextual rapport building videos. Yak, Y-A-C, great for asynchronous chat. Kona, this is an amazing Slack plugin that allows you to have red, yellow, green check-ins and really get to know your team members, even if you've never met them in person. They help you manage EQ within your team as a manager, which is really awesome. And the list goes on and on. If you're trying to start a handbook, check out Almanac. It's a phenomenal tool for starting to wrap your head around taxonomy and knowledge codification within your organization. But definitely follow me on Twitter. I'm always talking about tools and trying to surface new tools. And remember, tools are only half the equation. As a manager, you have to be the enabler and the empowerment of your team. Create a psychologically safe atmosphere where people don't feel like they're missing out on something by not being in a shared physical space.
Absolutely. Well, super helpful. Darren, thank you so much for coming on the show and for all that you've done this year and in years past in enabling more companies to navigate the challenges of distributed work. It's really exciting to see more and more companies embrace this model. And as someone who's super passionate about the employee experience, I'm glad that folks will have more options around the types of companies they'll be able to choose to work for in the future. So thanks again for coming on the show and so great chatting with you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe for the weekly drop and feel free to share around with your people and talent colleagues. I'd love your feedback, so please leave a review and let us know what you enjoyed and what types of topics you'd like to see covered in the future. The more reviews and subscribers we get, the more quality content we can consistently deliver to you. If you're interested in being on the podcast, feel free to reach out to me at russica@engageandempower.org. See you next week.